As some of you might have noticed already, this video is considerably longer than most of my other ones, so I divided it into 3 sections. Parts on Rationale, where I cover what's in this build and why I chose these components, the build itself where I get this thing assembled, and last but not least, some testing and a few final words. Feel free to skip ahead if you're so inclined. But first, let's take a look at what Project Serin actually is. Serin is a small form factor video editing workstation that I'm using to replace the laptop that's been powering this channel over the last year. While it's never quick, the Acer Aspire 5750G was fast enough for me to fairly comfortably edit in 1080p, but now that I've switched to 4K, it's pretty much unbearable to use for editing, and has really held me back in terms of what I can produce. So without any further ado, let's take a look at what I've packed into this machine. Let's start off with the case. I'm using the Cubitech Mini Center, an extremely tiny ITX enclosure. This may seem like a bit of an unorthodox choice, but considering the hardware I'm going to put in it, there's no real reason to build the system into anything larger. I'm a big fan of small form factor builds and personally really enjoy the challenge of having to work around extremely tiny space constraints. The fully aluminium construction, coupled with the fact that I was able to pick this up for just a hair over £30, made this case a really attractive option for this build. Now let's move on to the heart of this build, the CPU. I've got the Intel Core i7-6700, which is a real beast of a processor in its own regard. I opted not to buy the 6700K, as in this system I have absolutely no plans of overclocking it. The case I've got really doesn't offer that much in terms of heat dissipation, and I didn't have the budget left over to factor in the price of a Z170 motherboard, the additional premium for the 6700K over the 6700, and the price of an aftermarket cooler. Speaking of which, I'll be using the infamous boxed heatsink for this build. We'll see how well it keeps up later. For this build, I've decided to go with the Asus H110i Plus D3. Coming in around £50, it's definitely a cheaper board in the ITX lineup, but it has all the features I need. To be honest, in this case I just shopped around for the cheapest motherboard that would be compatible with the other hardware I've got, and I came to this Asus board, so it just sort of made sense. It might not be the prettiest motherboard out there, I'm really not a huge fan of the faux gold Asus love to lavish their lower end boards in, but then as there's not a side panel in this case, I really don't care what it looks like so long as it works well. The RAM was pretty simple to select. I've got 16GB of Kingston HyperX Fury DDR3 clocked in at 1866MHz. Why did I choose this? Well, it was the cheapest RAM available that came in the capacity I wanted. In my experience, buying higher end RAM only really makes sense for extreme overclocking, which again I won't be doing with this system. One thing to note is that you will need DDR3 if you're using this motherboard. Initially, I mistakenly purchased some DDR4 on the assumption that every other motherboard I'd seen ran on that standard, but as Skylake supports both DDR3 and DDR4, you'll need to check which type you want for your specific motherboard. Every system needs storage, so for this I've got a 120GB Kingston HyperX Fury SSD, along with a 2TB WD Green hard drive. As you might expect, I'm going to be using the considerably faster SSD for my operating system and most frequently used programs to make sure they all load up very quickly, and then the hard drive for mass storage. Prices of SSDs are falling, but unfortunately for my needs they're too high for me to go fully solid state based right now. A 2TB SSD is quite literally an order of magnitude more expensive than the Western Digital drive I'll be using. As for why I chose this particular hard drive over higher performance options at similar price points, it comes down to 2 things. The first of these is sound. Faster hard drives can be fairly loud, and in my experience these WD Green hard drives manage to keep the noise levels to a minimum. Heat is the other problem, which the slower spinning 5400 RPM platters will help to resolve, which is especially important considering that there will be virtually no airflow in this area of the case. Finally, let's get on to arguably the most important yet most commonly overlooked part of any build, the power supply. I'm using an old favourite, the Corsair CX430M, for a few reasons. Firstly, it's cheap. This build was created with a very tight budget, so I don't really want to be overspending on anything. Secondly, it's modular, which means I can cut down on excessive cable clutter, which is very important for a small form factor build like this. Finally, it's pretty reliable. I've got variants of it running in 6 or 7 machines, and none of them have had any issues, so I can only hope that my good experiences continue with this unit. The astute amongst you may have noticed the lack of a component found in most builds, the GPU. The reason I've not got one here is quite simple. I didn't have the budget left over. Now, running off of integrated graphics for a while would make absolutely no sense for a gaming build, but I remind you, this is mainly a machine to help me work more effectively, and while GPU acceleration within some of the applications I use is great, it's by no means necessary. You might actually be surprised how well Intel's latest generation of integrated graphics actually perform. Sure, they're not going to replace a dedicated GPU anytime soon, but they're easily capable of some light gaming. Alright, now we've got all the components covered, let's get on to the build itself. The first thing that we're going to need to do is take the motherboard and place it on top of a non-conductive surface that you're not too worried about getting scratched a little. The box that the motherboard came in should do nicely. We're then going to want to unhook the retention arm by the CPU socket, align our processor and drop it in. Once it's in nice and snugly, we can lower the retention arm and, with a little force, get the CPU properly installed into the motherboard. Next, take the box cooler and place it so that all 4 of the little plastic pins on the bottom pass through the corresponding holes on the motherboard. Then press on 2 of the pins at a time in a diagonal arrangement until you get a nice little click which lets us know that the heatsink is installed correctly. Installing the RAM is a pretty easy task. Open up all the slots, grab a stick of RAM, align with a notch, then press it in. Then we can plug in the CPU fan, which I forgot to do earlier. Now we should be ready to crack open the side panels and get to installing the hardware in the case. The first order of business is getting the little motherboard standoff screwed in onto the motherboard tray. As we're going with Mini ITX, it's as simple as just screwing in all 4. At this point I would say to install the IO shield by pressing it into the back of the case, but as it turned out I couldn't actually get the motherboard fitted with it in place because of a clearance issue with the front IO, so I just left it out. This won't cause any real problems aside from the fact that there's a big hole in the back of my case, but it's just extra room for airflow, right? Anyway, so once the motherboard was in place, the next order of business is plugging in all of the fiddly front panel connectors. These were a bit challenging, with the HD audio cable really not being long enough and the rest having plenty of excess length. But once they're all done, it's onto the drive mounting. In this case, it works with the semi-toolless method. First you need to screw in these rubber grommets onto the bottom of the drives, and then you can slide them into place. One trick I used was pre-installing all of the cables onto the drives, as they're much harder to manage in the tight confines of the case. Speaking of pre-installing cables, I used the same trick with the power supply installation, as once you get the power supply installed it completely blocks almost all access. Once I'd done that, it was a simple matter of just moving the power supply into position and screwing it in. It's not the world's most beautiful cable management job, but you can't do that much better in a machine of this size. Now I'd love to say at this point that everything went swimmingly and the machine just worked, but unfortunately there was something wrong with the original heatsink, so I had to switch it out with a slightly different one that I had on hand. People always joke about ending up with a spare box CPU cooler, but it can definitely be handy every now and then. Alright, so now we've got the system up and running, let's take a look at how well it actually performs. I'll be comparing it to the machine I was using before, the Acer Aspire 5750G, and its specs are up on screen right now for anyone who's interested. So now let's take a look at 3D Mark 11, an application that tests both the CPU and GPU. According to 3D Mark, even though I don't have a dedicated graphics card installed, I'm still getting around double the performance in this area, which is really a testament towards the improvements Intel have made to their integrated graphics. And yes, predictably, the physics score is a heck of a lot better, considering the much better CPU. Unigine Valley tells a bit of a different story, with only a slight difference in performance between the two machines. I think this might need a bit more investigation in the future, if that's something you guys would be interested in seeing. Finally, we come to some comparisons between the speeds of the drives. I do find it a little funny how even the relatively slow hard drive I chose for this build still considerably outperforms the old drive in my laptop, but hey, I'm not complaining. One thing you might be worrying about in a case this small with no fans of its own is heat, so to test this I ran IDA64's stability test for about half an hour. So the CPU definitely got a little warm, with a max temperature of 89 degrees centigrade, but that's just below the threshold where I'd start getting worried. And yes, the case does get warm too. The internal temperature topped out at around 50 degrees, but try as I might, I couldn't find a way to heat this machine up any more than that, so while it might not be as cool as I might like, I'm still within a comfortable range. So in conclusions, was this build worth it? Absolutely. I can't really describe how much of a difference it's made to editing performance, but most of my render times have been cut tenfold or more, which is pretty awesome to say the least. So what's next for Serin? Well, the most obvious upgrade would be to get a graphics card for it, but right now I'm actually doing fine with the integrated one for the most part, so it may be a while before I can justify that purchase. Anyway, thank you very much if you've made it to this point. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and subscribe if you're interested in seeing more content like this. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask away in the comment section, I'll be sure to reply to as many as I can.